The first snowfall always arrived in silence. It would begin as a whisper, soft flurries drifting down from a steel-gray sky, dusting the rooftops, the bare tree branches, the narrow paths that wove through the village. By morning, the world would be transformed, buried beneath a heavy white quilt. For most, winter was a time of stillness, a season when life retreated behind doors, huddled close to the warmth of crackling fireplaces. But for Daniel, winter meant something else. It meant waiting, watching, hoping. It had started years ago, when he was just a child. The first time he'd seen the stag, it had been little more than a shadow in the snow. Thin, trembling, ribs pressing against its frost-covered coat. It stood at the tree lean, just beyond the village, its dark eyes hollow with hunger. Even at 8 years old, Daniel had understood what it meant to be hungry. He had seen the way people tightened their belts when winter dragged on too long, how his mother stretched meals to feed their small family. And though they had little, the sight of the struggling animal had awakened something in him, an ache he couldn't ignore. That night, he had slipped out with a handful of bread and a few withered apples. He had placed them at the edge of the forest, his heart pounding as he hurried back inside. By morning, the food was gone. The following night, he did it again, and again, and again. It became a ritual. Every winter, when the snow deepened and food grew scarce, the stag would return, always at the same spot, always waiting. At first, it was cautious, vanishing into the trees if Daniel lingered too long. But over time, the space between them grew smaller. It no longer fled at the sight of him. It stood, watching, its great dark eyes reflecting the flickering glow of his lantern. It learned the sound of his footsteps in the snow, the steady rhythm of his breath in the frozen air. And in turn, Daniel learned the stag's language, its subtle movements, the flick of its ears, the way it lowered its head in quiet gratitude. It was an unspoken understanding, a connection woven in the stillness of winter nights. Yet no one in the village understood. Wild animals are dangerous, his father warned. You can't trust them. It's just a deer, others scoffed. It won't remember you next year. But Daniel knew better, because when the first snowfall arrived, the stag always came back. And year after year, Daniel would be there, waiting for the moment when a frail creature would step from the trees, trusting that kindness could survive even the coldest of winters. The seasons change, but some things remain the same. Winters passed, and with each return of the snow, Daniel's bond with the stag deepened. What had once been an act of quiet kindness had become something more, an unspoken connection, something neither of them could fully understand but both felt nonetheless. The stag was no longer just a desperate creature seeking food. It had become something else, a companion, a guardian of the silent woods, a piece of the winter itself. As Daniel grew, so did the stag. Its once frail frame grew stronger, its antlers larger and more imposing. The villagers often marveled at its size from afar, whispering that it was unlike any stag they had ever seen. Some called it a spirit of the forest, an omen of the old world. Others dismissed it as nothing more than an ordinary deer, fattened by a foolish boy's generosity. Daniel didn't care what they thought. Every year, the stag waited for him at the same spot, just beyond the village, where the trees stretched high and the snow lay undisturbed. It would stand motionless, its dark eyes fixed on him, waiting as if it had never forgotten, never doubted that he would return. And Daniel always did. At first, he still kept his distance, setting the food down and stepping back, letting the stag approach on its own terms. But as the years passed, the gap between them grew smaller. One night, when he was 13, he took a risk. The stag had lowered its head, crunching through the apples Daniel had left in the snow. Slowly, cautiously, Daniel extended his hand, his breath catching in his throat. For a moment, the stag hesitated. Then, in a movement so slight it could have been imagined, it leaned forward, just enough for the tips of Daniel's fingers to brush against the coarse fur along its muzzle. A thrill of wonder ran through him. It lasted only a heartbeat before the stag withdrew, shaking its great antlers as if uncertain of what had just happened. But it did not flee. It did not vanish into the trees. It only watched him, as if waiting to see what he would do next. Daniel smiled. He didn't need words to understand what had just happened. The stag trusted him. That winter, he began spending more time with it. He spoke in hushed tones as he laid out food, telling the stag about his life, his worries, his dreams. It was ridiculous. He knew, talking to an animal as if it could understand. But in some ways, he thought it did. The stag would tilt its head, ears twitching as if listening. Its eyes, dark and endless, held something more than mere instinct. One evening, after he had whispered about a fight he'd had with his father, the stag did something it had never done before. It took a step closer. And for the first time, Daniel realized that this bond was not one-sided. The stag did not just return for food. It returned for him. The winter of Daniel's 15th year was the harshest anyone in the village could remember. The snow came early, burying the roads and freezing the river solid before the last autumn leaves had even fallen. The winds howled through the valley, rattling shutters and seeping through the cracks in old wooden homes. And worst of all, food was scarce. Crops had failed that summer due to an unexpected drought, leaving storage cellars emptier than they should have been. Hunting yielded little, as even the animals seemed to sense the severity of the coming months and had disappeared deep into the forest. In Daniel's home, meals grew smaller. His mother stretched thin broths as far as they would go. His father worked tirelessly to barter for grain, and Daniel did his best to ignore the gnawing hunger that became a constant companion. But no matter how empty their pantry became, Daniel never forgot the stag. Each night, he bundled himself in layers and trudged through the knee-high snow, carrying whatever scraps he could spare. Some nights, it was half a loaf of stale bread. Other nights, just a handful of frozen berries or a single withered apple. It wasn't enough. He could see it in the stag's eyes, in the way its frame had grown thinner, its movements slower. Even with its thick coat, it shivered under the brutal cold. The ribs he had once seen in its youth were visible again, pressing against its flesh like sharp ridges beneath the fur. And Daniel felt helpless. One evening, he stood before the stag, empty-handed. For the first time in years, he had nothing to give. His family had eaten the last of their bread that morning, and there had been no extra scraps to sneak away. A deep guilt settled in his chest as he met the stag's gaze. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his breath curling into the freezing air. "I don't know what to do." The stag did not move. It only stared at him, its dark eyes reflecting the dim moonlight. Then, slowly it lowered its head, not in defeat, but in something that felt almost like understanding. Daniel clenched his fists. He could endure hunger. He could endure the aching cold and the hollow feeling in his stomach. But watching the stag waste away, powerless to help, was something else entirely. He had spent years caring for this creature, keeping it alive through every winter. He could not fail it now. The next night, he made a choice. He divided what little food his family had left, setting aside a small portion before his mother could count the dwindling supplies. It was a selfish thing to do, a reckless, desperate thing. But as he watched the stag eat, its body trembling with exhaustion, he knew he would do it again. No matter how hard this winter became, he would not abandon it. The first time Daniel overheard the hunters talking, he felt his blood turn to ice. It was late afternoon, and he had gone into the village square to help his father stack firewood near the blacksmith shop. The cold was unrelenting, biting through his gloves as he worked, but it wasn't the weather that made his fingers tremble. It was a conversation happening just a few feet away. "There's a stag in the valley," one of the men said, his voice gruff and certain. "A big one. Should fetch a good price for meat and antlers." Daniel froze. They were talking about his stag. He turned his head slightly, pretending to adjust his grip on the woodpile, his ears straining to catch every word. "It's been sighted near the eastern tree line," another hunter added. "Things gotten too comfortable. Ain't even afraid of people anymore." A third man chuckled darkly. "Makes our job easier." Daniel felt his stomach twist. He knew times were hard. The village was desperate, and a stag that had grown used to humans was an easy target. It made sense. They were struggling, just like his family, just like everyone. But the thought of someone raising a bow or setting a snare for the very creature he had protected for years made his chest tighten with something dangerously close to rage. He couldn't let it happen. That night, when the rest of the village huddled indoors against the cold, Daniel slipped away. The path through the snow was familiar, his feet instinctively finding their way to the clearing where the stag always waited. But this time, something was different. The stag was there, its great form still and watchful beneath the skeletal trees. But it was not alone. Tracks. They surrounded the clearing, deep impressions in the snow, leading toward the place where Daniel always left food. Boot prints. Large ones. The hunters had been here. Panic surged through him. He rushed forward, scanning the trees, searching for signs of traps or hidden snares. His pulse pounded in his ears as he reached the stag, breathless, heart racing. The stag did not run. It only stood there, watching him with those dark, knowing eyes. Daniel exhaled sharply and placed a trembling hand on its neck, his fingers brushing against its thick, cold fur. "They're coming for you," he whispered. The stag did not react. It only blinked, as if it already understood what he was saying. Daniel swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had to do something. He had to warn it, chase it away, make it fear this place before the hunters returned. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he knew the truth. The stag had never feared him. And because of that, it had never feared people. And that trust, the bond he had spent years building, might now be the very thing that got it killed. He had to find a way to save it, before it was too late. Daniel lay awake that night, staring at the wooden beams above his bed, his mind racing. He had to act fast. The hunters wouldn't wait long. If they had already tracked the stag to the clearing, it was only a matter of time before they set their traps. Rolling onto his side, he pressed his knuckles against his lips, thinking. He couldn't simply warn the stag. It didn't understand danger the way he did. And even if he tried to scare it off, how far would it really go? The clearing had been its safe haven for years. It had no reason to fear this place. But what if he could make it fear? The idea formed quickly, a reckless, desperate thought. He wasn't even sure it would work. But he had no other choice. Slipping out of bed, he dressed in silence, layering himself against the cold. He took a deep breath, then reached for the small lantern beside his bed, careful not to wake his parents as he crept toward the door. Outside, the village was eerily quiet. Snow muffled every sound, and the bitter wind cut through the streets like a ghost searching for something to claim. Daniel moved quickly, his heart pounding with urgency. When he reached the clearing, the stag was already there, waiting for him. This time, Daniel didn't bring food. He didn't approach with careful steps or whispered reassurances. Instead, he did something he had never done before. He raised his arms and shouted. The sound split through the night, shattering the silence like breaking ice. The stag jerked back, ears flicking, muscles tensing. It didn't run, but it was wary. Good. Daniel grabbed a fallen branch and swung it through the air, letting it crack against a nearby tree. "Go!" he yelled. "You have to go." The stag flinched but didn't flee. His throat tightened. This was harder than he thought it would be. Every instinct in his body screamed against frightening it. He had spent years building trust, forging a bond that felt unbreakable. And now, he had to break it himself. He clenched his fists. Then, steeling himself, he picked up a handful of snow and hurled it toward the stag's hooves. That finally did it. With a powerful movement, the stag turned and bolted, crashing to the trees, disappearing into the shadows. Snow sprayed in its wake, swallowed by the endless darkness of the forest. Daniel stood there, breathless, watching the spot where it had vanished. His chest ached, though he couldn't tell if it was from the cold or the weight of what he had just done. Would it come back? Would it understand why he had done this? He didn't know, but at least for now it was safe. The next morning, the village stirred with quiet tension. The air was sharp with frost, the kind that made each breath feel like inhaling shards of ice. Daniel wrapped his scarf tighter around his face as he stepped outside, trying to calm the unease twisting in his stomach. He had done everything he could. The stag was gone. But was it far enough? As he made his way through the village, he caught sight of the hunters gathered near the tavern. They were talking in low, eager voices, their breath forming white clouds in the cold air. Their bows were slung over their shoulders, quivers full, knives strapped to their belts. They were ready. Daniel's heart pounded as he slowed his steps, listening. "We set the traps last night," one of them muttered. "Tracks were fresh. It's still in the area." Another nodded. "We'll get it by sundown." A sickening dread settled deep in Daniel's gut. The stag hadn't gone far enough. It was still close, still lingering in the only home it had ever known. And if he didn't stop them this time, it wouldn't escape. Before he could talk himself out of it, he turned sharply and headed toward the forest. He moved fast, his boots crunching against the snow, his breath quick and unsteady. The cold bit his face, but he barely noticed. His mind was focused on one thing: finding the stag before they did. By the time he reached the clearing, the sun was already climbing higher, sending pale light through the branches. And then his worst fear confirmed itself. The tracks, fresh ones, leading back toward the trees, deeper into the woods. Daniel cursed under his breath. He had scared away from the clearing, but not far enough. It was still too close. The snap of a branch sent his pulse skyrocketing. He spun around. The hunters were coming. Panic surged through him. He had to act fast. If they saw him out here, they would know something was wrong. They would tell his father, and he would never be able to warn the stag again. His gaze darted back to the fresh tracks. There was only one thing left to do. Taking a deep breath, he planted his feet firmly in the snow and stomped. Boot after boot, he crushed the tracks, kicking up loose snow, dragging his feet to smear the trail. His fingers were already numb, but he bent down and scooped up handfuls of powder, scattering it over the marks, trying to erase the stag's path before it was too late. The crunch of approaching footsteps sent fear clawing up his spine. He had only seconds left. With one final desperate motion, he threw himself against the nearest tree, pressing his back into the bark, forcing his breath to slow. A moment later, the hunters appeared at the edge of the clearing. Daniel held still. They scanned the ground, frowning. "Tracks were here last night," one of them muttered. Another cursed under his breath. Must have moved on already. For a few agonizing seconds, they hesitated. Then finally, "Come on, we'll try further north." Daniel stayed frozen as they turned and disappeared into the trees. Only when the silence returned did he allow himself to breathe. His hands were shaking, his legs weak, but he had done it. For now, the stag was safe. Daniel didn't return to the clearing for days. Not because he didn't want to. Every fiber of his being ached to see if the stag was still safe, but because he couldn't risk it. The hunters were still watching the woods, still searching. Any movement out of place would draw suspicion. So he waited. Each night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if the stag had truly gone. Had it finally learned to fear this place? Had it traveled deeper into the forest, beyond the hunter's reach? Or was it still out there, cold and starving, waiting for him? The thought gnawed at him. By the fourth day, he couldn't take it anymore. At dusk, when the village quieted, Daniel slipped out once more. The snow had hardened underfoot, making it easier to walk without leaving deep prints. The cold air burned his lungs, but he barely noticed. His heart pounded as he approached the clearing. Empty. A strange mix of relief and sadness washed over him. The stag was truly gone. He had spent so many years protecting it, feeding it, watching over it, and now it was just gone. He exhaled sharply, shoving his hands into his pockets. "It's for the best," he muttered to himself. But the silence around him felt hollow. He turned to leave, and then a sound, barely audible over the wind, a soft rustling in the trees. Daniel's breath caught. He turned slowly, heart hammering, and there, standing just beyond the tree line, half hidden in the shadows, was the stag. It was watching him. A lump formed in Daniel's throat. "You're still here," he whispered. The stag didn't move. For a long moment, neither of them did. They simply stood there, watching each other across the snow-covered ground. And in that moment, Daniel realized something. It understood. The stag hadn't just disappeared because it was afraid. It had listened. It had trusted him. And now it was waiting not for food, but for him. A cold wind blew between them, sending a shiver down Daniel's spine. He took a small step forward. The stag lowered its head, something calm and knowing in its dark eyes. Daniel felt his chest tighten. He had saved it, but somehow, in ways he couldn't quite explain, it felt like the stag had saved him, too. He took one last look before stepping back, nodding slightly, his own silent message. Go. This time, the stag turned without hesitation, and then, with powerful strides, it disappeared into the night. Winter passed, and with it, the worst of the village's hardships. By the time spring arrived, the snow melted into rushing streams, and the trees, once skeletal and barren, stretched toward the sky with renewed life. The hunters had long abandoned their search, moving on to easier prey. The stag had vanished into the depths of the forest, just as Daniel had hoped. But even as the seasons changed, something inside him remained unsettled. He had spent so many years watching over the stag, protecting it, feeding it through the cruelest winters. Now that it was gone, a strange emptiness followed him. Every time he passed by the clearing, he half expected to see those dark eyes watching him from the trees. But the space remained silent, until one morning. Daniel had gone to gather wood near the forest edge when something unusual caught his eye. A path. It wasn't a human trail, no footprints, no wagon marks. But the undergrowth had been disturbed, the earth pressed down by something large. His pulse quickened. Without thinking, he followed. The trail wound deeper into the woods, past places he had never dared explore. The trees grew taller, their branches forming a dense canopy, filtering the sunlight into golden patches along the mossy ground. Birds flitted overhead, their songs the only sound in the stillness. And then he saw it. The stag stood in a small clearing, bathed in the dappled morning light. But it wasn't alone. Beside it, nestled in the tall grass, was a fawn. Daniel's breath caught. For a long moment, he just stared, his heart pounding in his chest. The stag turned its head, meeting his gaze, and in that instant Daniel understood. This was why it had come back. Not just to see him, but to show him. A quiet, overwhelming emotion filled him. Something deeper than gratitude. Something wordless and ancient. It was as if the stag was saying, because of you, we survived. Because of you, life continues. Daniel swallowed past the tightness in his throat. He took a slow step back, giving the stag its space. He wouldn't stay. This wasn't his moment to claim. But before he turned to leave, he did one last thing. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small piece of dried apple, one he had tucked away out of habit, even though he no longer expected to use it. With careful, deliberate movement, he placed it on the mossy ground, a silent offering, a quiet thank you. Then, without another word, he stepped away. As he disappeared back into the trees, he didn't look back. He didn't need to. The bond they had shared wasn't something that needed words or final glances. It had been built over years, in trust and sacrifice. And now, it lived on, not just in memory, but in a life that had been given a second chance. And that was enough.